Okay, good evening. Hello, everyone. This is it's one of my favourite things, talking to councillors about planning, believe it or not. Yeah, good evening. I'm Martin Hutchings. I work on the Planning Advisory Services programme concerned with helping councils get local plans in place, and I'll take you through some of the work that we do on that and what we're finding during that work in a moment. It feels like, doesn't it, changes to plans and plan making are a constant. Even, in the short time since I put this presentation together, Michael Gove has announced another consultation on, I think, strengthening planning policy, something like that, on brownfield land. So just another consultation when some of the other consultations still sort of haven't finished, or they're still sort of being swept up. So yes, it does feel chaotic at times, and I think it's important that, despite all of the sort of myriad of changes and announcements, to remember that there are some fundamental aspects of plan making and making local plans that stay the same, and they probably will stay the same. And that one of the things your local plan is going to need when you're making a local plan, it needs good project management, and your officers need the resources to put together and deliver a programme of putting your local plan together. We work in an evidence-based system. We need good proportionate evidence. That's what we base our policy on. Our plans won't please everyone, but they are based in fact and on evidence. That's very important. You need to work with your neighbours, stakeholders, partners. There's only one or maybe two councils that truly are islands. But most of us, will be planning in a way that needs to recognise what is happening next door and beyond often. And, we can and we should load some of the environmental considerations in here. Most environmental issues, they don't stop at your geographical boundaries. So that's very important as well. So, and plans get independently examined. So it's important that all of these bases are covered when we're putting our plans together, if we're going to have a plan that's made sound. So just some comfort that despite, a lot of the sort of nitty gritty about plan making changes and moves around, there are some fundamental things. The basic system, we don't think is changing that much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some recent and important changes, developments to the plan making system, go through some of our work supporting councils, what we've learnt, and then some things that we think are on the horizon to look out for. So next slide, please, Steve. Okay, so recent changes. On the 20th of December last year, Michael Gove made an announcement, and at the same time, the National Planning Policy Framework was revised and launched. And the key thing, I think, here, the key overall message is to councils to get their local plan in place. Come on, we need plans in place. Preparing and maintaining up-to-date plans should be seen as a priority. This is very much the message. And we'll look at some of the consequences and fallout from that in a couple of slides' time. But the big message with this NPPF is councils, come on, get local plans in place. Talking about targets and housing numbers, calculating housing need. There's a lot riding on this, and a lot of discussion. And what would it actually mean? Were they going to change some of the ways that housing numbers are being calculated? But not much has really changed. In honesty, the use of the government standard method for calculating housing need is the default for establishing housing need, and the wording accompanying that in the NPPF now says that it is an advisory starting point. And in some quarters that's sort of been heralded as a new stance. Now it is new for the NPPF, but it's literally been part of planning policy, planning practice guidance, and that wording has basically been lifted from planning practice guidance, put into the NPPF, and the word advisory put next to it. So I think the thing to remember here is that the standard method, someone turn off there, I can hear some sirens in the background there, sorry, because we're talking about plan making. The standard method, the government standard method is about establishing your housing need. The local plan delivers the housing requirement, and the housing requirement is the need after things like constraints on land have been factored in. And it's an important distinction that often gets conflated a lot of the time. So that's a very important thing to note. So there The government has announced a couple of incentives to get plans in place as well. So all about, again, speeding plans, making up, getting plans in place. So if an adopted plan currently has been adopted less than 5 years ago, so it's less than 5 years old, then local planning authorities are no longer required to identify and update each year a supply of specific deliverable sites for housing. So they don't need to annually keep their 5-year housing land supply topped up, if you like, during those first 5 years that a plan is adopted. So if your plan's less than 5 years old at the moment, that annual supply of housing don't need to comply with that. The other change along the same sort of lines was that if your plan is at an advanced stage of preparation at the moment, then until it's adopted, then you only need as a council to demonstrate a 4-year housing land supply. So that's going to have knock-on effects for decision making, essentially, while you've got a new plan in place in that first 5 years, and it helps as well in terms of speculative development if your plan is at an advanced stage of being updated. So there's a change to just needing a 4-year housing land supply requirement if you're updating your local plan at the moment. So next slide, please, Steve. So a couple of other important things. Green belt, big issue, lots of noise around the green belt. Yes, yeah, very important issue. The version of the wording that was consulted on back in December 2022, when the changes to the NPPF were first mooted, those changes didn't make it into the NPPF. Now, those changes originally were linking quite specifically meeting housing numbers and reviewing the green belt. It was essentially saying that councils wouldn't have to review their green belt if that was the only way or the only means of meeting their housing number requirements. So the main change is that link to housing hasn't appeared in the latest NPPF. So what the wording now says is that councils aren't required, they're not required to carry out a green belt review. But it does go on to say that councils may choose to review, in exceptional circumstances, which aren't defined, they may choose to review their green belt to meet housing. So you don't have to, you're not required to, but you may want to as a means of meeting housing. So it's not a trump card as many thought it might be, but this no requirement wording, it may make councils feel a bit bolder in terms of whether or not they're going to review or consider green belt in terms of meeting housing need. However, you know, if you don't review or consider reviewing your green belt as part of meeting a housing requirement, because numbers or the numbers are at a place where you need to find additional land. If you don't review your green belt, you may at examination have to explain why you've not gone to look into the green belt to find housing land. So, some councils might feel, well, if we're not required to do it, as the wording says, then we're not going to look into our green belt. It depends what sort of place you're at. But you may be asked at examination why that element of looking for land hasn't been looked at. So, that's just something to consider. And sort of linked to that in some ways, the 35% housing urban uplift. Now, I don't know how many of you are in councils that affects, but the sort of biggest 20 cities were a couple of years ago given an additional 35% housing uplift. So whatever their housing need requirement using the standard method came up with, that was an additional 35% was loaded on top of that. So that urban uplift has now been incorporated into the NPPF. So it's always been controversial, but it shows that the government, they're committed to that 35%. And the consultation I mentioned earlier on brownfield, that's quite linked to that. That's been mentioned quite a lot in this latest announcement by Michael Gove in terms of cities meeting that brownfield land requirement, and that the cities that it applies to meeting that requirement themselves and not hiving it out to other places. So there's an interesting there's potential tension there for cities when you combine that with what we just said about the greenbelt situation. The soundness test, in the last consultation on the NPPF, the requirement for the plan to be justified in one of the tests of soundness was taken out. It was proposed to remove it and, to make the examination process easier. However, not having to demonstrate that a local plan is justified, I think, was really robustly challenged in the consultation process, and many say, rightly, that's been abandoned. How can you find a local plan sound if it's not justified? So I think that was part of the sort of arguments against that. So that didn't appear, but it was a significant proposal that was put forward. So transition. So in terms of the new MPPF and when it applies, well, if you're reviewing your plan at the moment and you've got to what they call Regulation 19 in terms of consultation, if you've got to that stage after the 19th of March 2024, then the new MPPF requirements kick in for your local plan. So some of the things we said about 5-year housing land supply or the 4-year housing land supply will apply. So if your plan's already reached this point, so if your plan is at Regulation 19 when these changes were announced, then the new changes in the MPPF won't apply. So there were quite a lot of councils that paused their plan production after getting to Reg 19 stage, waiting for these changes to see if they could act on them. But because the government has said that it doesn't apply to plans that are beyond Reg 19 after the 19th of March, there's quite a few plans that won't benefit from some of these incentives. So it's just a matter of timing. So there's not sort of a blanket approach there, but if we understand where your local plan is in the process, we might be able to tell you how and when that applies to your plan. The next slide, please, Steve. So local plans, so generally, I think the appetite from government, they've always had this ability to intervene, but I think the written ministerial statement by Michael Gove on the 19th of December, I think it really upped the game in terms of the government intending to intervene where councils weren't getting their plans in place. And 7 councils were specifically directed to produce timetables for Michael Gove and send them into him. So basically updating their local development scheme. And Lee Rowley, the Minister for Housing, is also coming down heavier on development management on authorities that are showing signs of not performing. So I think it's just a growing government appetite for intervening in local plans. And there's been other instances where councils have been told that they can't, if they were thinking about withdrawing their plan from examination, they've been told that they can't. There's a few quite sort of highly publicised examples of that recently as well. So updating or reviewing your local plans. So whenever a new MPPF comes out, it's always good practice to think, well, how does this affect our local plan? So, all councils, I'm not saying all councils have to make changes to their local plan, but you should be thinking about, has the MPPF, the new changes, has that affected any elements of our plan significantly that we should be considering? And there was also Michael Gove, when he made the announcement for the 7 councils to update their timetables, he also mentioned that he expected all councils to have an up-to-date timetable in place. And he even asked for those councils to send him a copy. So, it's just something maybe to ask your planners, the new MPPF, has that had any significant impact on our plan making activity, on our current plan? And are we doing anything about it? And, the answer might be yes, we've had a look. But there's nothing that really changes, or there may be some plans to start reviewing things. So updating your local plans in this current system until the new system is announced, which is mooted to be in the autumn, so possibly November onwards this year. If you're updating your local plan and relying on the current system of planning, your plan has to be submitted for examination by the 30th of June 2025. So there's plenty of councils. Most of our focus at the moment is working with councils that are trying to get that plan in place by June 2025. There's one of the key things to remember if your council is trying to get your plan in place is the duty to cooperate. Now, as part of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, the duty to cooperate, which is quite a controversial thing in planning, has been rescinded. But that part of the Act has not been enacted yet. So if you're planning in the current system, under current planning law, the duty to cooperate is something that your local plan making is going to have shown that it can demonstrate that you've complied with the duty to cooperate. And it's quite an important thing because many councils, because it's been rescinded by the Levelling Up Act, are under the impression that they don't need to demonstrate the duty to cooperate. But if you're in this current system, going for a plan by June 30th, 25, you do need to demonstrate that. So yes, duty to cooperate is still relevant. So next slide, please, Steve. So just a little bit about how Planning Advisory Service is supporting local plans. We operate on what we call critical friend basis. So we're not inspectors. We don't inspect councils' plans and tell them they've got to get better. We're a critical friend. We look at councils' local plans. We look at project management aspects of plans. We look at the evidence base. We help councils look at the duty to cooperate. And we have a critical friend review on how well they're doing and come up with recommendations for maybe some of the gaps. A lot of local plans, we found ways that maybe councils can find different ways of doing things, either to bolster what they're doing or to maybe shave some time off the overall process, so to make it a little bit more efficient. So that's the focus of our support around those three areas, and that's focused on councils planning in this current system. But at the moment, we are potentially, if you're putting your local plan, if you're having a review of your local plan at the moment, and you're not planning because it's too early to get your plan in place by June 2025, then in some senses, you haven't really got a planning system to operate in at the moment, because the reform planning system isn't going to be launched until autumn, November this year. So what do you do in the meantime? So we are working with a bunch of councils to help them keep their plan making going, working on what do we know about the new system, and taking a sort of common sense approach and trying to get work done on a basis where, you might, they call it no regrets work, which I don't like that term specifically, but it's working with councils to help them keep their plan making going, but without maybe wasting work that might not be relevant in the new system. So we're working with some councils to help them do that. And we're also prototyping a few of the new things that have been announced alongside planning reforms to help speed up the plan making process. So the government's quite keen on project management tools that we're going to be helping prototype and get in place with some councils to help them do that. So that's helping councils sort of in between planning systems. And we're going to be putting together some networks, and we'll be doing some topic-based events and some training modules as elements of this new planning system become clear. So two sides to our plan making support. One is what we're calling the business as usual, councils getting plans in place by June 2025, and the reform system. So there's two strands to our plan making support. Next slide, please, Steve. Just a few things that we've learned about plan making, and none of this is rocket science, but we do find that this comes up time and time again, and it's useful just to sort of go through it. So the programme of work for a local plan, often we find that the project plans that councils work to don't contain enough detail or sufficient detail, and don't often realistically factor in available resources, and that can often mean that the project plan that councils are working to are often unrealistic, and at worst sometimes they're unachievable. Or we find that project plans are created for the stage that a council's at. So doing a scoping stage, a project plan for doing that, and then a project plan to get to the first part of a consultation, then a project plan for getting to the second part, and then a project plan to take you through to examination. We find that the councils that are programming their work best are the ones that put that program together from the start for the whole thing. And it's not to say that things don't change, but it just means you don't see going back to the beginning each time you get to a new stage of your project plan. The other thing is decision making, and in its governance and how councils are set up to help the planning team make key decisions about their local plan as they're putting it together can sometimes not be in sync with the decision making that's needed on a timely basis. So often, we work with councils where the governance arrangements aren't clear, and it's important to have a clear governance structure for the production of the local plan. So it's clear what types of decisions can be made by the planning team and the members that they're working with, but also what decisions need to be made by the cabinet and the wider council. just so that those sign-offs and decision times can be factored into that plan making process. We've worked with councils where some cabinet decisions are taking up to sort of 4 months, sometimes 6 months to get through, and that's just not helpful for officers putting a plan together. So we're encouraging officers to talk with members and members to help come up with a different way of governing the production of the local plan and decision making, so that it actually fits with the timetable for the local plan. So yeah, consultation and engagement. That's with communities. Council's doing really good work and using new technology. We think that's a pretty strong aspect of local government at the moment. I think where things do get difficult is with statutory consultees, working to different timetables, working to different priorities, getting that input maybe from highways, from health, all those sorts of things. That's a big issue for local plans and getting a timely plan together. And often it's down to establishing good relationships, forging constructive relationships and contacts, and understanding agendas and who you're working with on that stakeholder management side of things. The evidence base, I touched on that earlier. The way the planning system is set up at the moment means that unfortunately councils, they go sort of belt and braces to the nth degree on evidence, because of the often for the numbers of challenges that come forward during the plan making process and during examination, challenges to the evidence base that councils have put together. I think there's lots of good things proposed for the new planning system, where government have sort of committed to helping councils put together a more proportionate approach to evidence, and yeah, helping protect evidence bases from challenge once we get into the later stages of plan making and examination. So I think that's a positive coming out of the reforms, is changing that approach to the evidence base. So yeah, and the last thing I've got on here is just leadership. The time it takes to get plans made often leaves plans vulnerable to changes in leadership, election cycles, changes of political control, and that's why it's really important that the local plan is developed as far as possible, with the best interests of the whole place in mind. I know politics comes into it, but it's a really frustrating experience putting a plan together that gets really far down the track, and then there's political changes and things get derailed or taken back a stage. So it's trying, in whatever way you can, to get those governance arrangements in place that can protect the plan as far as possible from wholesale changes when things change constitutionally in a council. So and with the reforms, a shortened timetable period, 30 months a plan cycle has been suggested. That will help with that. How realistic 30 months is another conversation. So I think my last slide now, Steve. So on the horizon, I think now that the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill has received royal consent, there are many changes being made to the planning system, many of which still need to be enacted. The changes to the MPPF announced in December, I think the key things that are coming out from that we've gone through earlier. I think with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, I think what we're going to be seeing some consultations coming forward on is probably on national development management policies. So taking policies that are about subjects and topics that have a sort of national application, taking those out of local plans and positioning those nationally, that should help speed up plan making. Street votes is another thing that is going to be consulted on. That's something that the government are really wed to. And an infrastructure levy, a change to the way that the community infrastructure levy and Section 106 contributions is governed, is going to be consulted on shortly as well. I think net zero energy efficiency standards, that's something that we really do need to pay attention to with our plan making. And the future home standard is going to be introducing some things that may help with that. And there's some consultations out at the moment. And then, of course, we've got the new government. We have no idea if or when we will get a new government. If we don't get a new government, we carry on with the changes that are going through at the moment. If we do get a new government, are some of the changes going to be stopped, or will we carry on as we are for a little while? Who knows? But that's something that is on the horizon. We need to pay attention to. So that's me come to an end. Thank you very
Brilliant.
much for listening.
Thank you so much there, Martin. I think that was really comprehensive. There's a lot to unpack. I'm sure there's a mountain of questions. So just a reminder to colleagues to put your questions in Slido. The link is in the chat function. I will hand over now to Shelley, who's going to take us through some of the changes to the decision-making process.
Great, thanks. And it's lovely to be here tonight and lovely to kind of see you all. Yeah, so I'm going to cover kind of development management. So that's normally the kind of lion's share of the workload within planning departments. It's the giant sausage machine of getting applications and proposals and kind of out through to making decisions. And around kind of 90% of decisions nationally are made by officers within planning teams within councils. And applications are, I think, the most exciting bit of planning. It's definitely the part of the planning system where most residents and communities kind of interact with. So I'm sure for those of you on the call, it's what most of the emails you get about planning are related to. They're linked to a particular application or a particular proposal that's being considered. So I'm going to cover kind of why development management is important, what kind of work we're doing with councils at the moment, and what's on the horizon for the future as well. Next slide, please, Steve. There we go. Right. So what is development management? So it's around the efficiency, so the kind of making of quick decisions, but also kind of defendable outcomes, and then translating to delivery on the ground. And planning committee is the sort of normal interaction for members. Some of you on the call might sit on a planning committee, either as a member or as a ward councillor going along to speak on behalf of the residents. Planning committee is a kind of quasi-judicial function for councils, so it's almost like a jury. It's a really tough gig if you're a planning committee member, because it's kind of politically neutral. You listen to the advice officers give you, you kind of weigh that evidence in the balance against views from residents and other parties. So you know, it's a kind of really interesting part of governance and decision making within a local authority. And it's normally got a balance of parties and representatives for each council sat on it. There are cases where the chair has a deciding vote, depending on how councils are set up, but in most cases, all people have an equal voice and an equal weight within a planning committee. So it's a really kind of unique part of the local authority. And development management also normally encompasses planning enforcement. I don't like the word enforcement. I prefer kind of monitoring and compliance. So that part of the planning department that makes sure things are being built as they should be, or unauthorised developments not happening. And again, I'm sure you all receive a lot of emails about that, about things being built too high, trees being knocked down, fences being put up when they shouldn't. That's the kind of predominant contacts that I used to deal with. Next slide, please, Steve. So why is development management important? Well, it's important because it is the most kind of, I suppose, politically sensitive part of the planning system in my view. So there's tremendous amounts of local and national political interest in planning decisions that are being made, but also kind of some of the challenges to decisions and some of the kind of emerging case law that happens from appeals and legal proceedings. There's been lots of increases in permitted development in the last few years. So development that would have required planning applications and planning consents has kind of been taken out of the planning system and now covered by a kind of permitted development, which means it doesn't require planning consent anymore, or it requires a kind of lighter touch prior approval process. So there's a real kind of deregulating and liberalisation of the planning system around what does and doesn't require consent. It's important to know about the planning application fee increase. So recently planning application fees have increased. They're now index linked, so they will increase year on year. That's really welcome and is going to provide an income stream for planning departments. However, that's set against some really, really tough challenges at the moment around recruitment and retention. So there are really big issues in development management and planning teams around the retaining and recruiting of really experienced officers to deal with those kind of complex applications. And we know that around 25% of experienced officers have left the public sector since 2010. So a quarter of the workforce has evaporated out of council planning departments, many of them leaving for private sector work or leaving the profession entirely. And we also know that's set against the context of most planning departments having on average a 40% reduction in their kind of core budget. So most planning departments at the moment are kind of trying to operate with less staff, less money, and effectively kind of one arm tied behind their back. So whilst the fee increase is really, really welcomed, it's going to be quite kind of limited in its reversal effects of some of those really big challenges. And everything's become more complex, I would say, definitely within the last 5 years. What officers have to consider, the kind of complexity of applications, what needs to kind of go into considerations is much more voluminous, much more complex than it used to be. And the other important thing to know, and I'll cover it more in more detail in the next slide, is that some of the kind of performance rules and some of the kind of triggers and targets that local authorities have to adhere to in their development management is going to be changing. Next slide, please, Steve. I think there's a bit of a delay with my screen, so bear with me. So, yes, right, council's in trouble. So development management is monitored by government. There's a kind of continuous monitoring of how councils are performing in their decision making, both on the speed of applications that are being determined and on the quality. So in terms of speed, councils are judged on the volume of applications that are determined with either an 8-week or 13-week window. And for quality, the government monitored the number of planning appeals that are overturned, and that needs to be less than 10% of the overall volume of applications determined. The kind of one caveat to that is that at the moment, extensions of time are allowed. So an extension of time is where the applicant and the council agree that even though that 8 or 13-week target's not going to be met, they both agree to an extension of that time period to get the application. And that can kind of mask some performance issues within local authorities. And we know that actually that process is going to kind of disappear shortly. So there's going to be a lot more councils who maybe struggle to show that they are making speedy decisions within the kind of time frame that government currently monitors. So there are some councils in trouble on the kind of special measures naughty list at the moment. So there are 3 councils that are designated on the basis of quality. So that means over 10% of their applications were overturned at appeal, both through decisions by officers, but decisions at planning committee as well. And what designation means is that applicants can choose whether they want their application determined by the council or whether they want the planning inspectorate to step in as the government agent and make the decision on their planning application. So unfortunately for councils that are designated, they still have to do a lot of the work of processing that application, but they just don't get the nice healthy fee that comes with it. That goes straight to the planning inspectorate. And as Martin was saying, we know that kind of intervention is something that the government is very keen on, or kind of up to do more of, or signalling the intention to do more of. And so at the moment there are 17 councils that are currently at risk of designation over the speed of decision making, and there are a further 12 councils that are kind of skirting close to that 10% mark in terms of quality. Now there is some crossover between those figures, so there are some councils that are risk of both and some councils that are a risk of only one, but there's definitely a kind of increased scrutiny on councils at the moment. Next slide, please, Steve. So what are we doing at the moment? So our main programme of support at PAS is supporting those councils that are at risk of designation or designated. And we do that through a kind of variety of tricks up our sleeve. So looking at kind of development management focused peer challenges, planning committee reviews or development management reviews. So that's where we really get into what are the processes that are happening, where the efficiencies can be made. We effectively run kind of MOT diagnostics on planning departments and on planning committees. But we also do a lot of training as well. So whether that's training to members through doing planning committee training, or training to officers doing kind of appeal or inquiry training or customer service training. And we also make a lot of stuff. So we make a lot of tools, a lot of resources that we put as much as possible on our web pages. And a lot of those are designed to be kind of self-service or, you know, kind of self-check, kind of health check processes for planning departments to do. And we tend to then put kind of those information on the website. So we've most recently created some guidance around planning performance agreements or pre-application processes, and some code of conduct and delegation for planning committees as well. And our bulletin is the place where we kind of launch and advertise those resources and those kind of offers to council. So if you aren't already signed up to our bulletin to get all the inside goss, then please do so as soon as you can. Next slide, please, Steve. Great. So what we are learning. So one of the key things we found, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone on the call, is that there is a massive correlation between having an up-to-date local plan and making good decisions. You know, it's not rocket science. Your local plan sets out the strong policy framework for what a council does and doesn't want to achieve in terms of its priorities, but also what it does and doesn't want to see in terms of the development that comes forward. So there's a really strong correlation between not having a local plan or having an out-of-date local plan and a less robust, more inconsistent kind of decision making. And that's normally where we see kind of performance issues arise, where there's that inconsistency or the kind of reactionary decision making. What we are finding is that it's becoming even more and more critical for officers and members to kind of work together on planning committee and be trained together. That kind of mutual respect and understanding of roles, you know, officers understanding how challenging a member's role is sitting on planning committee, members understanding kind of how officers need to present factual evidence and kind of what does and doesn't constitute a material consideration. I watch an unhealthy amount of planning committees, I must say, and some of the best ones I see are where there's a real symbiotic relationship between officers and members, you know, working together as kind of one council to make those decisions. And so certainly we're seeing that kind of need to re-establish that mutual respect, and that really good working relationship is becoming more and more important. And I think that's degraded slightly over the kind of pandemic and working at home and being kind of less interfacing in person in the office as well. So that's something we're working hard with councils to kind of help improve and rebuild. We also know it's harder for councils to make quick and defendable decisions. There's so much more to kind of deal with. There's a lot of increased complexity of what needs to be considered, and that is all in the face of kind of real resourcing issues and a kind of I suppose intense kind of scrutiny of what. So we're also finding that kind of pre-application engagement is becoming even more and more important, and we're seeing councils really boost their pre-application services to work collaboratively with agents and applicants to kind of head things off at the pass to deal with that. And I suppose the last point on this slide is around the kind of importance of investing in leadership. The most kind of crucial role that you play as a councillor is really being that champion of your planners, those champion of your planning departments. You know, one of the kind of predominant reasons that we've lost a quarter of the workforce is around a slightly more kind of toxic culture on social media, a bit of kind of planner bashing, and actually councillors have got a really important role in helping kind of explain what planning is, what planning does, kind of pushing back on some of that negative narrative, and really championing your planners is something that is coming across loud and clear for us. Next slide, please. So what's on the horizon? Well, as if things weren't complex enough, there is more and more complexity that is going to be kind of added into the development management process. And one of the biggies for that is biodiversity net gains. There's going to be lots and lots of more technical information that applications are going to need to be grappled with, and the decision-making process through development management and post-consent monitoring is going to be the really kind of sharp end of where BNG gets implemented. There's definitely a focus on design and beauty. So ministers have been having a keen interest in the idea of beautiful places, and everywhere should be beautiful and lovely, and there's a real kind of focus on design. So there's a real big push and national policy that's come in, and how this is going to be articulated in councils is the need for councils to create authority-wide and site-specific design codes. So there's going to be a kind of vehicle for setting design expectations that development management and that decision-making process is going to grapple with. And a reoccurring theme, there's definitely more scrutiny on performance and more emphasis of designation for underperforming councils. So there's an increasing appetite for that. We understand that there's going to be a consultation shortly on changes to the performance regime. So those indicators I talked about of speed and quality, so making decisions within a certain time frame or having a certain number of overturns, we understand that there's going to be a consultation on shifting away for that and looking at different indicators, different measures of whether a council's performing effectively. So changing goalposts in how development management performance is looked at. And greater scrutiny of statutory consultees. We know that government has undertaken a review of the performance and interaction of statutory consultees. So we all know that it's really important for statutory consultees such as Historic England, Natural England, the Highways Authority to kind of all get involved within the decision-making process and comment on planning applications. They themselves are under kind of extreme resources and recruitment problems as well. So the government is definitely putting a lot of scrutiny and undertaking kind of performance review of statutory consultees and their role in providing timely responses to applications. And cost recovery, that's going to be a new kind of welcomed, I think, addition on the horizon. So the autumn statement announced that some types of applications, we don't know which types at this point, will be accompanied by a cost recovery fee for determining that application, and that's likely to be through the current vehicle of planning performance agreements procedures. So that's effectively a time management tool that councils and applicants use to kind of set actions, timescales, and kind of triggers for both doing pieces of work to move an application forward. I think that's really welcome. We've recently done a bit of benchmarking and found that most councils, even the most highest performance ones, on their pre-application processes were only achieving around 37% cost recovery. So officers weren't charging the right amount to kind of recoup the time and effort spent on pre-application processes as well. Next slide, please, Steve. So what else is on the horizon? Well, irresponsible applicants. So the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act has introduced some new processes around commencement notices and completion notices, and also this idea that applicants' previous behaviour can be taken into account. So it's a really interesting one. So it's going to be looking at where a developer or an applicant is not building out their current permission as consented, or they're not meeting the conditions, or they're failing to kind of adhere to the permission properly, or they're not even kind of building out as fast as they said they were going to, then all of those factors can be taken into account as a material consideration if that same applicant comes forward with an alternative site or a different proposal. So it's very different from the process we've got now, where a planning permission goes with the land and isn't at all tied to the applicant's behaviour. So that's designed to, I think, provide additional scrutiny. There's an idea that it will help clamp down on land banking, because it will look at where sites aren't coming forward as fast as had previously been anticipated. There's an introduction of street votes. So there's a current consultation on street votes at the moment. I've read the consultation. It's quite complex. It's quite, I think, cumbersome, and lots of procedures around who and when street votes will work. I think there will be some limited applications. We might get lots and lots of streets wanting mansard roofs in parts of the counties, but I don't know quite how kind of wide street votes are going to be. But one of the biggies is around the national development management policies. So there's going to be a consultation on effectively kind of national policies that are designed to replace parts of local plans. So everyone in their local plan probably has a heritage policy that pretty much says the same thing around protecting and enhancing heritage assets. So the idea is that some of these development management policies will kind of standardise or kind of take that up to a higher level. And will carry equal weight and in sometimes kind of top trump local plan policies as written in legislation. I don't think this is necessarily going to be such a bad thing. There's a little bit of nervousness about it, but Scotland have actually had a national plan with national policies for quite some years, and it works really quite well, and has been really effective in addressing some of those really big issues such as climate change and social inequality. So if you want to see what might be on the horizon, go and have a look at the Scottish National Plan and some of the national policies that are within that as well. And again, there's going to be more deregulation on the horizon, so an increase in permitted development legislation. So there's a kind of whole raft of changes on the horizon. Lots of things are going to be taken out of the planning system that currently require consent, and they include kind of building bigger extensions, so rear extensions, side extensions, loft conversions, lots and lots of additional changes. So going from changes of use, so changes from retail to residential, some other slightly more kind of less controversial things such as electric vehicle charging infrastructure, kind of fits to the size of people's houses to enable vehicle charging, and air source heat pumps are all going to be now not requiring a planning consent. But some things are going back the other way. Some things are going back in with more control and more requiring consents. And the one that gets a lot of airtime and a lot of press coverage is around Airbnbs, so short-term lets. So where areas have a kind of predominance of Airbnbs, it's different. It's not kind of regulated or licensed in the same way that houses of multiple occupation are at the moment. So there's a real kind of intention to bring that into some form of control for local authorities around the prevalence of that type of use within certain areas. And the fee increase. So yes, as I've kind of said, fees are going to go up for planning applications. On the whole, the private sector and applicants and developers and house builders seem quite happy to pay a bit more, provided they're going to kind of get the service. So it's a kind of welcome on all sides of the table. I think there's a kind of skepticism about whether that's going to really make any predominant difference to how under-resourced and funded the planning departments are. So I'm going to leave you on kind of 3 questions that you might want to ask your officers or go away and do a bit of research on. So I think number 1, if you're really interested, you can go and find out from your officers where you are on the performance league tables, and where the targets are being met. Hopefully that's all going to be a really comfortable story for you, but also to have a dialogue with your officers about if the criteria and performance regime change to different indicators. How do we think, when we know what they are, that your authority is going to perform? And likewise, having a discussion with your officers around some of these permitted development changes. How are they going to impact your authority? I'm sure there's lots of people on the call where Airbnbs and short-term lets is a real problem and has significant impacts on the housing market and the residents that you speak to. And then training is my last one, I suppose. There is so much change in terms of additional things being added to the system, changes to plan making, changes to decision making. Officers struggle to kind of keep up with all the changes and make sure their training's up to date. So it's a real ask for you to do as well. But particularly if you're sitting on planning committee, I think half the challenge is knowing what you need to know and then asking for the training, or kind of having that dialogue with officers about whether you can get some additional information or some training on some of those emerging issues. Thanks very much. I hope that was okay. That was a sort of whistle-stop tour of development management.
Thank you so much, Shelley. That was excellent. Yeah, again, lots to sort of help inform us there. And I've seen that there's already some questions that have come in based on what you were raising there. Just a reminder again, please do put questions on Slido. The link is in the chat. And please also vote for the questions that you'd like to be answered, so that we make sure we try and get through as many of them as possible. We're now going to hand over to Richard, who's actually going to take us through explaining how planning relates to the environment in 2024.
Thank you very much, Victor. And yeah, thank you for inviting me along. Steve, do you want to stop sharing just to give you a break from people saying next slide, Steve? And I've also just trimmed the presentation slightly to try to get it to run to time, because I'm looking at the clock and I don't want to run out of time for questions. That was smoothly done. Thank you. Okay, good. Yes, so I'm going to follow the same format as everybody else. It's a quick reflection on what the hot topics are at the moment, what we're up to, some frank reflections about what we're learning and what we're thinking, and where we're going next. I'm going to start with the Environment Act. It's 2021. It's a little bit older than some of the recent changes to the NPPF and the performance framework that we've heard, but it's really, really, really big, and it's really fundamental, and it does lots of quite heavy lifting on the stuff of life. It's about waste, it's about water, it's about air, it's about nature, which is the bit, I guess, that I'm going to talk about it. And it's really, because it's so big and because it's so basic and because it's so long term, I think it's still a bit of a work in progress. And in particular, from a local government perspective, I think, it's all very well to have a target that by 2050 this thing will have happened, or by 2070 we'll have reduced some other thing to 0%. What does that mean for us, like this year, next year, and what does that mean for us in local councils? Sometimes I think the role is quite clear and we're up and running, and I'm going to talk about biodiversity net gain in a moment. And sometimes the ask is really quite unclear and a bit murky, and it's one of those things that we're still kind of working out. So alongside the Environment Act, you will also, to varying degrees, have other sorts of commitments in this space, whether you've got a local biodiversity emergency, climate emergency, you've decided to accelerate and go faster than the carbon target for 2050. So this is, if you like, the hot topics of the moment. Just to go into it in a little bit of a finer grained detail. For the first time, we as a country are trying to do something called the Local Nature Recovery Strategy, or the Local Nature Recovery Strategy, of which there are 48. There's a kind of little picture on the right-hand side, so you can see, by necessity, they're quite big. They follow old county kind of areas or big unitary areas, or I think there are a couple of combined authorities that are coming together. The idea being, obviously, that we finish the 48, and then we knit them together into a national picture for nature for England. It's quite exciting. Hopefully we're going to have finished by March 2025, and then a sort of personal view, I suppose, then we can kind of lean into it and go, well, okay, we've got a pretty map, but what does it really mean, and what does it mean for us doing differently, and what does it mean for how we think about water and flooding and all that other kind of stuff. But yeah, interesting new experiment. Then there is, and it started 2 weeks ago on major applications, and it's going to be rolled out for non-major applications in April, a requirement that all planning applications, subject to various qualifications, because in planning it's always subject to various qualifications, all planning applications have to leave the world a little bit better than they found it. So the way that we do that is by we think about habitats, and you have to leave the world, the habitat, a little bit better than where it started, and that's already started, and it will be starting to roll through the system. And planning applications that you received, tomorrow, they'll major applications, they will have to have a plan for how they're going to do this. Again, slightly less well understood at the moment is a new thing called a protected site strategy, which is a way of using a kind of convening power that Natural England have to try to persuade landowners, farmers, local authorities, water companies, recreational users, to get them to sort of act together to improve the state of some of our most special places, our triple SIs, our European sites, because there was a report published, I think yesterday, explaining how lots of the stuff that should be some of our best assets is not in a good situation, and the protected site strategy will be rolled out over time to do something about it. And that in part, I guess, final point on the slide, is because there is this really sharp focus publicly about what we've been doing to our water, to our rivers. Sometimes of the year it's about water quality, sometimes of the year it's about flooding in some parts of the country. It's just that there isn't enough water, even as a starting point, and it's something that we're just going to have to get better at. So those are the hot topics. How we can help, I think it's fair to say that this bit of PAS is quite new. Like the DM that you've heard about and the local plans that you've heard about, that's been going, for a decade and a half. The environmental bit of PAS has been going for about 2.5 years. We work with various bits of government to try to help councils understand and respond to these new things. To be frank, in this room full of councillors, I think up to now it's been quite officer centric. It's been quite, can we understand the technical side of this? Can we understand the regulatory side of this? I think as soon as we feel ready, we're going to have to push this into the political space, the leadership space. Lots of this, the technical stuff will get you so far, but understanding how you want your local authority to respond to this agenda is something that councillors are going to be front and centre. And I think if I could plant one little seed with you, again, sort of Shelley gave you some questions. One of my challenges to you is I almost guarantee that in each of your councils there will be passionate, committed officer people. Maybe they already have a group. Maybe they already, have a little meeting that they go to every month, and they feel kind of slightly locked out, and they're not really sure how to get to you, and they're not really sure how to talk to you about the things that they want the council to do better and more differently. And I think I kind of talk to passionate, frustrated people quite a lot of the time, who just don't know how to get space for nature, space for the environment, when everyone is slightly stony-faced and talking about budgets and all the other kind of big things that you've got to worry about. So on a practical side, we run a network. So we've got 800 lovely people who belong to our BNG officer network. BNG has been a fantastic piece of work for us. It's been a really good advert for how local government can get together, work together, help each other out. The network is fantastically busy, and it's full of brilliant people saying, well, do you know what, here's something I've tried, here's something else I've created, and people are stealing from each other rather than starting with with empty sheets of paper, which is fantastic. And we've got a bunch of videos and we've got a readiness checklist to help people make sure that they've remembered to do all this stuff. The councillor's guide doesn't have a blue link to it because it doesn't exist yet, but hopefully next week we're going to do a councillor's guide aimed at people on planning committee, hopefully in time for you to receive your first planning application that talks about BNG, what you can push on, what you can't push on, and how the system is designed to work. Next up, we've got a kind of nature toolkit. So, you know, councils, I know it's difficult and it doesn't feel right often when you're thinking about financial pressures, but actually many councils, you're big, lumpy, financially powerful organisations, you own lots of land, you have lots of soft power as well. You have often town and parish councils who are passionate and engaged and really interested and want to kind of lean into some of these things locally. We've got this nature toolkit that allows you to have a kind of structured approach about, here are all these kind of things that you might want to think about and you might want to do differently, so that you can create a long list of ideas and then take it down to a short list of actual things that you can decide to do differently in the short, medium and the long term. Nutrient neutrality. If you don't know what nutrient neutrality is, you're very happy, and I hope you never have to find out, because it's a way of thinking about water pollution, and it is by far the most difficult project that we do. We're now got to a point where we're working with councils and catchments who've been given several £1 million to try to make a difference in water quality. Yes, it's interesting, difficult work. And then the last thing I think I've mentioned, protected site strategies. We're at the very early stages of understanding. To be frank, I think we're at the early stage of understanding, is this something that we in council support? Like, is this a good thing, or will it be a bad thing? Will it stop us doing things? It's just like, it's really early days for an important policy lever. And I think we're working out how it's going to work. So I guess just to share some kind of frank reflections, and just to sort of repeat the point, perhaps this is all quite new. I think the thing for me that's genuinely interesting is, here we've got, you know, DEFRA, who are thinking about farming and food, and whether we've got food security, and we've got Cabinet Office that's thinking about energy and energy security, and here we've got sort of local government slightly caught in the middle of all of these enormous forces. And do we really understand whether there's a role for us here? Do we want the role that might be offered to us here, where you've got, you know, Ofwat on the Environment Agency and water companies? And I think there's a real careful bit of thinking to be done about, what are the incentives for us to lean into this? What are the risks if we try to get engaged in it? Do we understand what our long-term liabilities might be if we start to roll up our sleeves and actually engage in it? Really interesting space. And it's a really hot topic as well. And I think there are many councils who just say, do you know what, we don't really care that much about some of the downsides, because we can't be seen to be complicit in all of this. We have to be seen to be engaging in this. We've got to push this thing along, because there are many, many big reasons for us to do that. There is, and I've seen there's a question, someone's got their mic up or something. I'm getting lots of sort of noise. There is a bit of a gap, as there always is, between how some of these duties get presented to councils and some of the funding. Biodiversity Net Gain has got some funding earmarked to it. Nutrients has got some money earmarked to it. I think lots of the other bigger picture stuff, it's really difficult to see how people are going to find the money to pay for it. And also, I suppose, you know, I'm here with my planning advisory hat on. Planning is kind of front and center what we do, but these things is much bigger than planning. And it involves necessarily, you know, using the power of local government to convene a much wider group of people, including, you know, farmers and landowners and all the other people who want to do other things in the countryside and in urban spaces. So I guess I kind of want to leave you actually with a bit of a warm feeling about this. I think because I'm, you know, we're doing a new thing and it's difficult, I do walk around frowning quite a lot. But actually, what this really is something a bit brilliant, which is we're starting to not just use the planning system to think about, well, where can we put houses that people don't hate them too much, and what do we have to stop anything happening to? We're actually thinking about using it in a much more creative way. about, well, what's already there and how can we make it even better, and how can we take this bit over there and that bit over there and join them up with a corridor that's better, of more use to wildlife. It's really, it's genuinely interesting stuff, and it speaks of a long-term commitment. When you're talking about how do you guarantee that this thing is going to work, how do you guarantee that the biodiversity is going to be protected? Well, it's because there's a legal agreement that protects it for 30 years. Like you do have to go into this with a degree of seriousness and kind of long-term intent, and I think that's really kind of interesting. And one of the things I've got an eye on, I don't know if this is going to be true or not, but it feels to me that when you want to talk to members of the public or voters even, that nature feels more relatable, like more real, than slightly more abstract kind of concepts like, oh, it's a carbon reduction target. Well, I don't know, some people get excited by carbon reduction targets, but I think it's more likely that people are going to get excited about, actually, this is about pollinators, this is about birds, this is about the things that we can remember from when I was a lad in the mid-1970s. I think I am going to say only one more thing off this slide, which is, I described this thing about a strategy. Like, it feels to me this is a kind of space where councils have more choices. When you're thinking about your local plan, well, you just have to have a local plan. And when you're thinking about planning applications, well, you just have to make decisions on them. This is a much more, well, do you know what? It's up to you. You're all going to be starting from different spaces. Your starting point is going to be different. Your land holding is going to be different. State of the environment is going to be different. Actually, how ambitious do you want to be? And I think some councils are really going to go for it, and other councils are going to go, do you know what? We'll just wait and see how this kind of develops. So I think this is my final slide, Steve. What's on the horizon? Well, there's that thing I was talking about, the environmental improvement plan, this plan for, if you like, Great Britain PLC, these environmental targets, big picture, long term, tree cover, all that kind of stuff. What does that actually mean for councils, and how are councils going to be supported to play their part of this big picture? Alongside all of this improvement, there's also, well, not just improvement, but we've got to do it faster. Faster, quicker, faster, quicker. That's always the sort of government mantra, isn't it? But it's about how can we speed up the planning of and the delivery of some of the infrastructure around energy and water, and how can we stop having 50,000 pages of environmental kind of impact assessment. And I guess just final point, I guess, is it feels like there's kind of an interesting space for councillors and politicians to negotiate here, because on the one hand you've got enormous public pressure, public rage even about water companies, air, all of this kind of, why aren't we holding everyone to account? River Action and those sorts of groups are doing a fantastic job and using the courts to do some of this work, and the Office of Environmental Protection has been formed to sort of hold government to account a bit better on all of this. But you also start to see enormous pressure in the opposite direction. So when you do try to do anything about it, you got people saying, well, we can't have pylons because they're ugly, and we can't have LTNs because of various other reasons, and we haven't been able to build a reservoir since about 1972. So really, really difficult navigation in the middle of all of that for, I think that's probably a job for councillors rather than officers. Right, I'm going to pass back to you, Steve.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much there, Richard. I know you're speaking to the converted with proud environmental Liberal Democrats that we are. And a party that's been leading the fight on sewage dumping. So, I think that's really helpful for what we're doing up and down the country on this agenda. I am conscious of time. I know we only have 15 minutes scheduled left, but I would maybe suggest that we will go over a little bit just to make sure we do get through as many of the questions as we possibly can. But before we do so, I'd like to hand over to Councillor Liz Green and Steve, who can just take us through the role that the peers play in this.
Thanks, Victor. I mean, I'll probably just step out of the way actually, and let Liz kind of talk actually, because I think one of the things we just were super keen to say was we've got a load of councillors in the room, and we are so the work that we do is so much helped by working with councillors, and so most of the really, really interesting things we do, we get to do hand in glove with councillor peers. So what we wanted to try to do was just promote the principle of what we do really as part of this. So I mean, we use them in 4 ways, I suppose. We do planning peer challenges. So there's corporate peer challenges that the LGA do, but we do some planning ones particularly, and they are super great fun. And someone said it's like having a holiday for a planner. But we do that with councillor peers, often open for many political groups as well. We also do committee reviews, so we use councillor peers who have got experience of sitting on planning committees to help planning committees look at what they're doing and improve a bit. We also do councillor training as well, so again using a councillor to working with an officer or working one of the PAS team to go and do some training. And then also we work as a bit of a conduit to set up councillor mentoring sessions as well between councillor peers. But I might just get out of the way and let Liz talk, because Liz does an active work with us as a peer, so hopefully she's going to sit here and say what a great job what a great piece of work it is and how keen it is for everyone to kind of join. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm actually sitting here in a very lovely Premier Inn, because I'm about to start a planning peer review tomorrow morning. Well, we did something this afternoon. So I'm not sure it's a holiday. It's actually bloody hard work. But what I wanted to say very briefly is why you should put yourself forward to be a member peer. And it's not just for planning. If you put yourself forward as a member peer in previous to doing planning, you've done adult social care or other roles, all of this crosses the member peer pool. Isn't just for planning, it is across all areas that the LGA operates in. So why should you put yourself forward? Basically, you'll learn a lot from others, and you'll use it in your own authority. You can steal and share ideas to your heart's content. Even the basket case authorities have examples of best practice, and most of them that you go into are not absolute basket cases. And weirdly, it gives you a bit of headspace. Maybe that's the holiday bit for planners, because it gets you out of the day-to-day grind of things that you're doing and gives you a bit of headspace to think around how you're tackling elements. Networking. We as councillors, and probably Lib Dems are the worst at this, and I do a lot of cross-party work at the LGA, we don't network. We think we're in our council and that's it. Actually, we need to network with others in the party, but also from other parties, so that you actually, when you've got a problem, you've got people you can go to and ask questions of, and you feel less alone. It can be quite lonely being a councillor, can't it? When I start some of my training sessions, I all start off with "you're all weird," because you stood for election, which automatically makes you a weird person. I'm weird as well. I am an elected councillor and have been for 20 plus years. And if you're a rising star, you want to do more, you're in planning now or whatever role you're in, and you want to do more, start networking now, because you'll really use that later. You get to know more about what the LGA can offer. So you've had a quick run through from PAS today on some of the things that they offer your authority, but we will be able, you will get more information on it once you become a mentor and you start to get out there and get to know what is happening at the LGA. You give back to the local government family. I am local government through and through, and I believe in local government, and it's a way of giving back. Last reason to do it, money. None of us get enough money in our allowances, and we have many people have to work as well. You actually get a day rate from the LGA, which is currently, I believe, £362 per day. For work that you are doing. And, there's nothing wrong with saying you need to do extra work, along with all the other things. So how does it work in the Liberal Democrats? I did try and double check. I've been a peer for about 15 years and it's changed in that time. So, but I believe what you do is you email Ryan Priest at the LGA. He works in our Lib Dem group rooms with Terry and Rob, and he will set you in the right direction for what to do. If you become a peer, you don't have to just do a load of work. The national and regional peers, Alan, Lisa and Sarah, will ask you if you're available for a particular piece of work, a peer review or a mentoring project are the ones that I mostly work on, and some training with PAS as well. You will be asked, are you available for this? Do you want to be put forward? If you say yes, you'll then be put forward to the council, who will then decide whether you actually get the role. You have a peer review that will be sent to them. So essentially, what's the biggest barriers? Why are you not standing? Mostly it's because as Liberal Democrats, you're hiding your light under a bushel. You're thinking, I don't know the answer to everything. I'm not an expert in planning. I've been planning chair for just under 2 years, and I'm doing work with PAS. I learn things. Water neutrality, who knew? That gives away where I am probably to those that know what's going on there. But you don't have to have all the answers as a peer. You don't have to know it inside out. You are not planners. You don't have to know all of that. What you have to be is an experienced-ish councillor who has something to give back to the local government family and that can work with, and you get training on both peer reviews and on mentoring. You don't have to give up the day job. You're in control of whether you take an assignment. So my request to you all, Stephen's put the link in there for Ryan's email address. Just drop him a quick link, a quick email, and do it whilst you're online now, because you're all online, so you may as well. Quick link, just go, Ryan, I've just been persuaded by Liz that I should become a peer mentor, sorry, a peer member. Can you tell me more? He'll send you in the right direction and talk you through the stuff. So that's it. I'm done. Oh, and I can't stay on a bit longer, Victor. Sorry. I've got to go out and have lunch with the other people. You do get a free lunch or free dinner.
You've sold it very well, Liz. Thank you very much for joining us while you're away from home. And actually, if you don't mind me just saying, I think the other side of the peer review is actually do take advantage of them if you get the opportunity to have a peer review. Because I know from my colleague, Adele Morris, that was done it for many years as well, you know, that actually it's a really invaluable opportunity to get to hear from those that know most about the planning system, and actually to have those off the record chats, or to chat with someone that understands the politics of planning, not just the officer perspective. So it is really, really invaluable. And Liz, thank you for making the time while you're actually on duty and on service.
I'm assuming none of the questions are for me, because everyone's just busy sending their email off to Ryan. And you know, if there is anything you want me to come back on, you've got others on the line that do this as well, so that they can answer it. And I'm off for a meal. So
let's use, thank you, Liz. So let's use the time that we've got left, and maybe a few minutes after we're due to schedule to finish, just to try and get through as many of the questions in the Slido function.